They erased my name. Not from a birthday card. Not from a casual email. From the work I had poured my life into. It hit me first on a gray Thursday morning in Atlanta. The kind of morning where the city hums beneath a curtain of drizzle. And even the honking cars sound distant. I opened my laptop at my desk in Brooklyn Tower. The glow of the screen painting my face pale against the dim office lights. And the realization landed like a heavyweight punch to my chest. Reports I had authored, projects stitched together from sleepless nights, late-night phone calls with clients, and spreadsheets I had perfected while the city slept, were circulating across the company. They carried my fingerprints, my strategy, my voice, but not my name. In the open plan office, whispers cut sharper than any raised voice. Colleagues leaned into one another, murmuring as if they were sharing gossip at a block party rather than talking about my work. "Did you see Derek's proposal? Yeah, Marcus is really impressed with Melissa's numbers. Plans, numbers, work, all of it mine." I smiled politely. I shook hands. I said, "Great job," the tone expected of a junior executive. A black woman trying to navigate a space that never promised her belonging. But inside, it felt like someone had scooped my name out of my chest and tossed it into a shredder. I wasn't new to pressure. I'd built my career brick by brick. Late nights at Brooklyn Tower. Early mornings catching MARTA trains with cold coffee clutched in one hand. Spreadsheets in the other. I believed that hard work was enough. That effort would eventually be recognized in a world that seemed designed to overlook people like me. For a while, it worked. Moments of recognition appeared like flickers of sunlight breaking through storm clouds. A manager's praise in a meeting. A coworker clapping me on the back after a sharp insight. A nod from Marcus during a quarterly briefing. Those moments felt like oxygen in a room suffocating with indifference. They made me believe that merit mattered. But oxygen is fleeting. First, it came in small cuts. A calendar invite that didn't reach me. A project reassigned, by mistake. An email thread where my contributions were conveniently left out. Then the cuts deepened. My reports appeared with Derek Lawson's name on them. My analyses repackaged. My recommendations repeated by people who had once asked me for guidance. Each moment chipped away at my faith in fairness. And the cruelest part? It was never loud. No slammed doors. No shouted insults. Just silence. The kind of silence that eats at your bones. One evening, I stayed late, long after the office lights dimmed. Brooklyn Tower had that hushed aquarium quality. Fluorescent light reflecting off polished surfaces. Elevators silent. My heels clicked down the hallway until I stopped outside the glass walls of the executive conference room. Through the glass, I saw Derek presenting. My slides. My words. My analysis. Executives leaned forward, impressed. One jotted notes. Another clapped. Derek smiled, basking in recognition that wasn't his. My chest burned. I pressed my palm against the glass, trying to steady my racing heart. That night, under the flickering light of my apartment kitchen in Brooklyn, I sat with my laptop. The hum of the city outside, sirens and neon, alive and indifferent, made the apartment feel simultaneously cavernous and claustrophobic. I replayed every slight, every stolen credit, every whisper that erased me. I thought of the girl I used to be, the one who believed hard work alone could carve a path through the world. That girl was gone. In her place sat Aaliya Brooks, a woman whose patience had been tested, whose name had been stolen, whose work had been hijacked. And in the silence of my small kitchen, I made a vow: if they wanted me gone, they would have to fight for it. The days that followed were a test. I arrived early, stayed late, delivered flawless reports, but opportunity slid past me like water through fingers. Meetings I had scheduled never happened. Ideas I pitched were shelved or reassigned to Derek. And always, there were whispers. She's slipping. Marcus doesn't trust her. Maybe she's burned out. Each word was a blade aimed at my reputation. And I began to understand the game. Brooklyn Tower wasn't just a building, it was a battlefield. And I had been drafted without my consent. Then came the charity gala at the Atlanta Marriott Marquis. The ballroom glowed amber beneath chandeliers. Laughter drifting in waves across polished marble. Champagne flutes clinking like tiny bells. I stood at the edge of it all. A single black woman in a sea of impeccably dressed corporate faces. My dress was neat, my hair flawless, my smile practiced. That's when Marcus Whitfield arrived. Not walking, but commanding the room. Tailored suit, polished shoes, presence so strong it silenced chatter. He handed me a glass of whiskey. Eyes glinting. He said, voice deep and deliberate. Around here, competence is only half the game. The other half, well, you know what that is. For a moment, the music, the laughter, the gala, all of it faded. His words were a hammer. But inside, something ignited. Not fear, not shame, resolve. I didn't bend, I didn't nod. I met his eyes, steady and unblinking. And in that silence, I made a choice. I would prove I didn't need approval to validate my brilliance. I placed the glass back in his hand and walked away. My heels clicked like a drumbeat of defiance across the polished floor. From that night, my patience hardened into steel. I saw Brooklyn Tower clearly, not built on talent, but on alliances, whispered favors, and hallway deals. And in those shadows, I began to prepare. A week later, Derek presented my expansion plan, the one I had drafted, polished, and rewritten through countless sleepless nights. Executives applauded. Brilliant, Derek, they said, and I sat in silence. My fists clenched so tightly my nails bit crescents into my palms. Watching my own name vanish in slow motion carved something sharper inside me than despair. It carved determination. By the time I stepped back into my apartment that night, rain streaking down the window like trails of neon tears, I whispered into the storm. Yes, it was worth it. Every late night, every sacrifice. If Marcus, you'll have to drag me out. Because I'll fight. That night, Aaliya Brooks stopped waiting for justice. She began building it, piece by piece. The days after the gala blurred into a haze of fluorescent lights and muted whispers. Brooklyn Tower had become a labyrinth. Each hallway a gauntlet. Every glance felt loaded. Every smile calculated. I moved through it all with precision. As if my body knew how to navigate the politics even when my heart was screaming. I started keeping meticulous records. Every email, every meeting, every offhand comment. I duplicated files, saved screenshots, logged conversations, Derek's presentations, Marcus's casual nods of approval. Each moment was a breadcrumb in a trail I intended to follow. Every oversight a puzzle piece in the web of deliberate erasure. But the psychological toll was heavier than I expected. The betrayal cut deep. How could they look at me, at someone who had worked tirelessly, who had given her blood, sweat, and tears, and act like I didn't exist? The silence of colleagues, the misattribution of my work, the casual theft of my ideas, it all felt like a systemic erasure. And it wasn't just professional. It was personal. It cut through the very marrow of who I thought I was. I found myself replaying scenes in my head. Late at night in my Brooklyn apartment. Neon lights painting the walls. City sirens humming like a relentless heartbeat. Each replay made the betrayal sharper. Each night, I wrestled with anger, shame, and a creeping doubt. Was I too much? Too ambitious? Too visible? Too black? I couldn't let myself crumble. That wasn't Aaliya Brooks, the girl who had built her life brick by brick, who had survived long nights alone in offices that smelled like stale coffee and fear. Wasn't about to disappear quietly. The first public test came in the form of a departmental meeting. Derek was slated to present the quarterly projections, my projections. Every slide, every chart, every strategic recommendation had been crafted with exacting precision. And yet, as I entered the room, the applause greeted him, not me. I felt my stomach twist. I took a seat at the edge of the table, smile perfectly poised. My hands rested on the polished mahogany, trembling only slightly, betraying the fury coiled inside me. Marcus sat at the head, leaning back in his chair, watching, evaluating. I could feel his gaze like a weight, assessing whether I would crumble or retaliate. The presentation began. Derek spoke smoothly, almost too smoothly, as if reading a script written by someone else. The executives nodded, impressed by his insight, unaware that each word, each calculation, was mine. I pressed my lips into a thin line, my jaw tight, resisting the urge to interrupt. The room hummed with oblivious admiration, and I counted the seconds until it ended. By the time the meeting adjourned, my hands had left imprints on the table. Nails dug into the polished wood. Each applause felt like a personal affront. And yet, beneath the surface, a different emotion was rising: clarity. I realized that anger alone wasn't enough. Rage without strategy would be my undoing. I had to be precise. Surgical. I had to transform every slight, every stolen idea, every whisper that erased me into ammunition. That night, I returned to my apartment. City lights reflecting in the glass like 1,000 tiny eyes watching me. I spread out files, emails, and notes across the kitchen table. The room smelled faintly of coffee and resolve. I started mapping patterns: Derek's opportunistic presentations, Marcus's subtle interventions, projects that had been reassigned without explanation. Each pattern told the same story. I wasn't being ignored by accident. I was being targeted. The first small victories were almost invisible. Emails that previously bounced for maintenance now reached the intended recipients after careful timing. My contributions, once buried, began resurfacing subtly in internal threads I had carefully monitored. But the psychological warfare wasn't over. Derek, ever aware of my presence, would glance at me during meetings with a smirk, as if to say, "You're next." I learned quickly to mask my emotions. A tight-lipped smile became my armor. Pleasantries were exchanged with calculated calm. But beneath the surface, my mind sharpened. Every interaction, every glance, every laugh in the office became data. I catalogued microaggressions, casual dismissals, and deliberate oversights with the precision of a forensic analyst. One evening, Marcus stopped by my desk under the guise of casual conversation. His tone was smooth, almost friendly, but the words carried weight. "Aaliya, you've been quiet lately. Make sure you're not losing momentum. Visibility is everything in this environment." I smiled, nodded, and thanked him, letting the words slide over me like water over polished steel. But inside, my mind raced. He thought I didn't understand the game. He thought I would bend, wait patiently, and hope justice arrived. He was wrong. The turning point came when I discovered a file, an email thread between Marcus and Derek outlining projects reassigned and credit redistributed. The level of premeditation was staggering. It was no longer just erasure, it was orchestration. They weren't just taking my work, they were mapping my disappearance. The weight of this knowledge was almost suffocating. Yet, paradoxically, it gave me clarity. I wasn't powerless. I had the evidence, the memory, and the intellect to fight back. I could see the patterns, anticipate the moves, and plan with precision. The emotional toll was still real. There were nights I cried alone in my apartment, the city's neon lights flickering like distant fireflies. But each tear was a release, a shedding of the self that had been naive enough to trust fairness would prevail. Aaliya Brooks was evolving. Patience was no longer just a virtue, it was a weapon. I began to cultivate quiet alliances, subtle signals to colleagues who shared my frustration, people whose intelligence and integrity mirrored my own. I learned who could be trusted, who was complicit, and who could be persuaded. The office was a chessboard, and for the first time, I could see all the pieces. By the end of the month, I had transformed the pain into focus. The girl who believed hard work alone was enough was gone. In her place stood a strategist, a hunter, someone who had seen the battlefield clearly for the first time. The silent war had begun. And this time, I was ready. Every glance that ignored me, every credit stolen, every whisper that belittled me was now fuel. Brooklyn Tower was no longer just a building where I had been overlooked. It was my proving ground. And I intended to win. The office had become a living organism, each whisper, each glance, each misfiled report pulsing like a heartbeat. I moved through it all like a ghost, unseen but aware, cataloging every misstep, every calculated oversight. Brooklyn Tower wasn't just a building anymore, it was the battlefield where I would reclaim what was mine. The first step was intelligence. I spent late nights at my apartment, laptop open, cross-referencing emails, memos, and shared drive logs. Patterns emerged: Derek's opportunistic presentations, Marcus's subtle steering of credit, projects mysteriously reassigned, each misstep traced back to a hand that wanted me invisible. And that hand? Thomas Whitaker. Thomas wasn't just a manager. He was a puppeteer. Every promotion, every setback, Every whispered comment was part of a carefully choreographed dance. He thought I was unaware. He thought patience equaled compliance. He was wrong. I started by planting small traps. Nothing overt, nothing detectable. I created controlled leaks, mock reports seeded with deliberate errors, accessible only to those who would take shortcuts and claim credit. I watched. I recorded. Every action, every misstep, every casual lie became evidence. At the same time, I strengthened my own presence. I subtly reminded colleagues of my contributions without overt confrontation. Remember when we projected Q3 growth? I drafted the analysis you're referencing. Small, almost invisible cues, like threads weaving a safety net. I cultivated allies carefully. Not everyone could be trusted, but there were those whose integrity mirrored my own. Maria, a financial analyst new to the team, had an instinct for detail that matched mine. Malik, a project coordinator, had quietly been marginalized. Together, we formed a silent web of observation and verification, gathering proof, readying ourselves for the moment that mattered most. But it wasn't just strategy. It was psychological warfare. I learned to anticipate Thomas's moves, Derek's petty opportunism, Marcus's subtle nudges. Each interaction became a game of chess. I smiled when expected, nodded politely, and absorbed every nuance, every slip, every micro-expression. One Friday, I orchestrated my first test. Derek had been bragging about a new initiative, claiming it as his own brilliance. I subtly introduced a contradiction in the data during a closed internal review. He presented it to Thomas the next week, unaware of the bait I'd laid. Thomas frowned, tension flickering in his eyes for the first time in months. I watched quietly from my desk, heart hammering, noting every reaction. The success was small but critical. I realized two things. First, Thomas was fallible. Second, this game could be played on my terms. Next, I turned my attention to communications. I created a private archive, storing every email, every memo, every documented conversation. I labeled, timestamped, and cross-referenced each entry. By the end of the month, I had an invisible dossier, a digital map of the manipulation and theft. Each file was a brick in the fortress I was building, proof undeniable, compelling, and impossible to ignore. It was during these nights, surrounded by the hum of the city, that I allowed myself a rare moment of reflection. How had I been erased? Not because of talent, not because of work ethic, but because they believed they could manipulate the system with invisibility. They underestimated the power of someone who refused to vanish quietly. They underestimated Aaliya Brooks. I rehearsed confrontations in my mind, each scenario sharper than the last. I practiced calm, controlled speech, each word a scalpel designed to expose, not attack. I prepared for the boardroom, for the gala, for any public forum where Thomas might attempt to assert dominance. Every interaction would be evidence. Every slip, every misstatement, every act of arrogance recorded. Then came the breakthrough. An internal memo, carelessly saved, revealed the orchestration of projects, the deliberate reassignment of credit, the silent sidelining of my work. My pulse raced as I copied, timestamped, and secured it. This was more than enough to force a confrontation, more than enough to hold Thomas accountable. But timing was critical. One wrong move, and the evidence could be dismissed as coincidence or miscommunication. I refined my approach. The goal wasn't just to prove theft, it was to expose the system, to unmask the puppeteer, to restore not only my name but my credibility. I planned a sequence. First, a private disclosure to Marcus, testing loyalty. Second, controlled leaks to Derek, testing response. Finally, a public revelation at the next executive meeting, where the evidence would be undeniable, and the board forced to act. The weeks that followed were a delicate balance. I moved like a shadow, present yet unseen, every interaction calculated, every document cross-verified. I maintained the mask of the polite employee, the composed strategist, while underneath, my mind raced, always 3 steps ahead. One evening, Malik approached me quietly. "Aaliya, are you really going to do this?" His eyes searched mine, a mix of admiration and fear. I smiled faintly, a cold edge beneath the warmth. "Malik, sometimes the system won't fix itself. Sometimes, We have to be the ones to rewrite the rules. By the time the week of the board meeting arrived, I was ready. Each piece of evidence meticulously organized. Each interaction rehearsed. Each ally briefed. Brooklyn Tower felt different that morning. The halls seemed narrower. The lights harsher. I walked to my desk. Heart steady. Mind razor sharp. The game was about to begin. As I entered the boardroom that Thursday, every eye turned to me. Thomas Whitaker, seated at the head, smiled smugly, oblivious to the storm he was about to face. Derek and Marcus flanked him, confident in their carefully curated roles. But I wasn't just walking in with evidence. I was walking in with control. I laid out my case calmly, presenting the meticulous chain of emails, documents, and corroborated testimonies. Each slide, each file, each timestamp punctuated the deliberate orchestration of credit theft and professional erasure. Thomas's composure faltered, just enough for everyone to notice. The room, once a theater of my invisibility, became the stage of their exposure. The board members leaned in, questioning, cross-examining. Each detail, every misstep, every manipulation was undeniable. The power dynamic shifted subtly but irreversibly. Thomas's smugness crumbled under the weight of incontrovertible proof. Derek squirmed. Marcus's calm demeanor faltered. And as I stood there, poised and unflinching, I realized the transformation wasn't just professional, it was personal. The girl who had once believed effort alone would protect her was gone. In her place stood Aaliya Brooks, strategist, hunter, survivor, and now, unshakable. The battle was far from over. But the first decisive victory had been claimed. Silence replaced whispers. The boardroom held its breath. And in that moment, I knew the war had shifted. I was no longer a target. I was the force to be reckoned with. Thursday morning in the Brooklyn Tower felt heavier than usual. The air thick with anticipation. Every echo of my heels on the marble floors sounded like a drumbeat counting down to war. I stepped into the lobby. Shoulders squared, eyes forward. Every glass wall, every polished surface seemed to watch me, waiting to see if I would crumble. At the head of the boardroom table sat Thomas Whitaker, his posture rigid, eyes narrowing as I entered. Derek and Marcus lingered by his side, their confidence thin, wavering beneath the tension that now hung like smoke in the room. They still didn't realize that today. I wasn't pleading. I was claiming my space, my power. I set my USB on the table, the cold metal pressing into my palm like a lifeline. "Good morning," I said, calm, measured, but weighted with months of preparation. The room was silent, every breath drawn, every glance stolen. Thomas raised an eyebrow, lips curling into a dismissive smirk. "Aaliya," he said, voice sharp, "I hope this isn't another baseless complaint. We're very busy this morning." I met his gaze evenly, holding the room's attention. "Not baseless, Thomas. This is documented, and the board deserves to see the full truth." I pressed play. Instantly, the projector came to life. Emails, memos, project drafts, and reports, all the evidence I had meticulously gathered, flooded the screen. Every alteration, every instance where my name had been erased, every time my work was presented as someone else's, laid bare in precise chronological order. Derek's jaw dropped. Marcus's usual smirk faltered, and Thomas's face tightened, a faint tremor betraying his otherwise stoic mask. The board members shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting from the evidence to him. I spoke, my voice steady but sharp, slicing through the tension. "Every single project I delivered, every insight, every analysis you've credited to others, was mine, and every time credit was stolen or my name erased, it was intentional. The pattern is clear, and here it is." The room held its collective breath. Thomas tried to cut in, voice rising. "This is fabricated. You're trying to undermine me with false claims." I let a small, controlled smile appear, one that didn't mock, but radiated quiet certainty. "Fabricated? Let's listen to your own words. Shall we?" I pressed play on the recording. Thomas's voice filled the room, cold and confident, outlining his deliberate moves to manipulate projects, sabotage my contributions, and secure credit for himself. Each word hit like a hammer against his facade. Board members exchanged uneasy glances. Derek's hands clenched on the table. Marcus shifted in his seat. no longer a shield but a witness. The dynamic had shifted. The balance of power was tilting. I continued, voice firm, unwavering. This isn't just about me. This is about accountability, integrity, and the culture we allow here. You cannot erase contributions and expect the truth to stay hidden. You cannot manipulate outcomes without consequence. Even Thomas's defiance began to crack. His smugness faltered under the weight of irrefutable proof. For the first time, I saw fear, not loud, not explosive, but sharp, undeniable, a shadow behind his eyes. Mr. Harris cleared his throat, voice low and commanding. Thomas. The evidence is undeniable. A full review is required immediately. Until then, you are suspended. Thomas rose, face flushed, hands trembling slightly, the aura of invincibility evaporating. Derek and Marcus were powerless. Silent, mere spectators to the fall of a man who once seemed untouchable. As I left the room, my heels echoed against the marble. Each step a declaration. Aaliya Brooks was no longer erased. I had reclaimed my name, my power, and my voice. The tension I'd carried for months, the frustration, the sleepless nights, the constant undermining, lifted with every stride. Outside, Brooklyn's streets were alive, neon lights reflecting in puddles from the morning drizzle. The city moved as always, indifferent and relentless, but I walked through it differently. The first victory was mine. The boardroom had confirmed what I had always known. I was not invisible. And now, I had the proof. Today was not the end. It was a beginning. And this time, I was ready for whatever came next. No one would erase my name again. The days after Thomas Whitaker's suspension were a whirlwind. A blur of whispered conversations and guarded glances. I moved through the office like a shadow of purpose. Eyes sharp, mind calculating every corner, every hallway, every desk where deals were struck behind closed doors. If Thomas was a storm, the storm had passed, but the air was still charged. And I wasn't about to let the calm lull me into complacency. Rachel found me first. Her presence at my desk was quiet but firm. A reminder that alliances mattered even in this tempest. Aaliya, she said, voice low, people are watching you, not just Thomas, Derek and Marcus. They're still trying to find a foothold. Be careful. I nodded, hiding the fire that had been smoldering for weeks. I know, I replied, and I'm ready. Every file, every thread I've tracked, every email, it's all in place. The first step was clarity. I needed to map the hierarchy. Identify every person who had touched my work, every hand that had either buried or hijacked it. By the end of the week, I had a network laid bare: names, positions, motivations, vulnerabilities. Derek, always brash, had a record of small-scale manipulations. Marcus, the silent type, had a few off-the-books favors that made him complicit. And both, like Thomas, underestimated me. I started small, a casual conversation in the hallway. A misplaced email returned, a subtle question at a meeting. Each interaction a test. A probe. I watched reactions, body language, micro-expressions. People revealed more about themselves in silence than they ever could in words. By midweek, I had enough leverage to shift the tides. The first confrontation was with Derek. He was arrogant, thinking his charm could sway anyone. But charm had its limits, especially when the target knew every move in advance. I cornered him near the glass wall overlooking the city. The skyline a jagged silhouette against the rising sun. Derek, I said, voice steady, I know what you did with the Carlton project. Every email, every decision. You didn't think anyone noticed. He laughed, a brittle, forced sound. You're imagining things. I've done nothing wrong. I tilted my head, letting the silence hang. You're right, you didn't do anything illegal, yet. But when your missteps come back to the board, don't say I didn't warn you. His face paled slightly. Charm crumbled into fear, the first cracks of doubt showing. That's all I needed. One small victory, one ripple that would spread. Next came Marcus, quiet, calculating, always lurking in the background. His misdeeds weren't as public, but they were no less critical. I called him into a meeting room under the guise of collaboration. But the blinds were drawn tight, the room charged with tension. I laid out the inconsistencies he had created in reports, the minor manipulations that had almost gone unnoticed. He leaned back, attempting composure. but the lines around his eyes betrayed panic. What are you going to do?" he asked. I smiled softly, the kind that didn't mock but promised inevitability. "Nothing, yet. But soon. Everyone will see exactly how deep this goes." Word spread quietly, strategically. The office's social pulse shifted. Whispers now carrying a new narrative. Aaliya Brooks was no longer just a target. She was a force. Someone who saw every move, anticipated every shadow, and was willing to strike when the time came. The next challenge was public. Theatrical. A meeting with the remaining executives, including Mr. Harris. They were wary, cautious, sensing the undercurrent of change. I presented the evidence against Derek and Marcus. Meticulous and undeniable, linking every manipulation to specific outcomes that had affected projects, client accounts, and internal metrics. Each piece was precise, leaving no room for dispute. Derek squirmed. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. Thomas's absence was still felt, but his shadow lingered. The two men had been his lieutenants. And now the fortress of intimidation was crumbling. Mr. Harris leaned forward, voice cutting through the tension. This is serious. You've compiled this yourself?" "Yes," I said, calm but firm. "Every piece has been tracked, verified, and documented. I am prepared to present it in full to the board. This isn't about revenge. It's about accountability, about integrity in this company." The executives murmured among themselves. I held their gaze, letting the room soak in the weight of months of sabotage and manipulation. They knew the tide had turned. That night, walking through the streets of Brooklyn, neon signs reflecting in puddles from a sudden drizzle, I allowed myself a brief exhale. The victories were small, but significant. Derek and Marcus were contained. Their influence diminished. The office ecosystem had shifted in subtle but irreversible ways. In my apartment, I reviewed the day's events, lining files, emails, and recordings side by side. The pieces of the puzzle had begun to coalesce into a pattern so complete that it could not be ignored, dismissed, or erased. I whispered to myself, quiet but resolute, "This isn't over." But the shadows are no longer in control. By the end of the week, whispers in the office had changed. Where once my name was missing, now it carried weight. People paused to acknowledge me in the hallway. Small gestures, a nod, a brief smile, recognition of a presentation, felt like fuel, not for vanity, but for focus. Each acknowledgement was a step toward dismantling the culture that had tried to erase me. And then came the final act, a pre-scheduled board meeting where I would consolidate my evidence against all who had conspired to undermine me. From Thomas to the silent facilitators of his schemes. The stakes were immense, but I was ready. I had sharpened my mind like a blade, honed my strategy, and understood the intricate dynamics of power and fear that drove this office. As I stood outside the boardroom, shoulders squared, reflection in the glass staring back, I realized something fundamental. This wasn't about victory over individuals anymore. It was about reclaiming the space that had been denied, asserting that my voice, my work, my name could not be stolen without consequence. Inside, the room awaited, the board, the executives, the lingering shadows of those who had underestimated me. They were all present. I stepped forward, hands steady, eyes clear. Aaliya Brooks was no longer the woman who quietly endured. She was the strategist, the force, the one who would ensure that justice was not a fleeting illusion but a permanent recalibration of power. And as I began to speak, presenting the meticulously curated evidence against every conspirator, I knew one undeniable truth. This was my world now, and anyone who had tried to erase me would understand. Finally, the cost of underestimating Aaliya Brooks. The morning of the final board meeting felt like the calm before a storm. Though the air in the city buzzed with its usual chaos, I walked into the lobby of the financial tower, heels clicking against polished marble, each step deliberate. My reflection in the glass doors stared back at me, eyes rimmed with exhaustion but burning with determination. Today wasn't about survival. Today was about justice. Today was about reclaiming everything they had tried to take from me. I passed the security checkpoint, my ID swiping without issue. Though I could feel the tension in the air like static, everyone on my floor seemed to move differently, colleagues avoiding eye contact. Whispers halted mid-sentence when I approached. Phones tucked away. My every instinct told me the web I had woven was working. They knew the storm was coming. The boardroom doors loomed ahead, massive and imposing, oak polished to a reflective sheen. I paused for a heartbeat, then pushed them open. Inside, Thomas Whitaker sat at the head of the table, expression calm but eyes calculating. Around him, the executive board waited, papers neatly stacked, laptops glowing, attention divided between him and the room. "Ms. Brooks," Harris began, voice precise, "this is your final chance. Present your evidence or face suspension." I inhaled, feeling the weight of every slight, every stolen idea, every whisper that had tried to erase me. I had rehearsed this moment for months, but nothing could fully prepare me for the electricity in the room. I stepped forward, USB drive secure in my hand, and locked eyes with Thomas. "Thank you, Mr. Harris," I said, voice steady, carrying the resonance of months of strategy, fear, and preparation. "Today, you will see not mistakes, not glitches, but deliberate fraud and manipulation." Thomas leaned back, fingers steepled, an almost imperceptible smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "Ms. Brooks," he said, voice smooth, "are you sure you're not wasting our time with baseless claims?" I clicked the USB into the podium laptop, and the screen behind me came alive. Charts, spreadsheets, emails, all highlighted, annotated, irrefutable. The room went still, not a cough, not a whisper, only the heavy hum of realization beginning to settle. "This," I said, pointing to a highlighted cell, "is a deliberate misreport, numbers altered to mask shortfalls, emails deleted to hide accountability, and all evidence leads back to Thomas Whitaker." Gasps rippled through the room. Heads turned, eyes narrowing, whispers spreading like wildfire. Thomas's smirk faltered, his hands gripped the arms of his chair, knuckles white. "You're lying," he hissed, voice sharp as glass. "Fabricated evidence. This isn't real." I advanced, keeping my gaze unwavering. "Fabricated?" I asked, letting the word hang in the air like a guillotine. "Then explain this." I clicked the next file. The boardroom speakers played Thomas's own voice, recorded months earlier. "Don't give me the chance. I'm too sharp, too dangerous. If she rises, we can't control her." Silence, heavy, suffocating. Thomas's eyes darted around, searching for allies, reassurance, a lifeline, but none came. The executives were frozen, their expressions shifting from confusion to disbelief to horror. I held the room's attention, voice calm, resonant, carrying every ounce of anger, strategy, and resolve I had stored for this moment. "This isn't just about me," I continued. "This is about every employee silenced, every idea stolen, every voice ignored because it threatened someone's empire. Today, we set the record straight." Thomas rose abruptly, chair scraping the floor, his face flushed crimson, a mix of rage and panic. "You'll regret this," he spat, trying to regain control. "This won't hold up. I will destroy you." I smiled, calm, sharp, unbroken. "No, Thomas, you underestimated me. You underestimated everyone you thought you could silence." I navigated through the digital files, presenting each manipulation, each fraudulent signature, each deleted record. The room shifted from skepticism to shock to outrage. Board members whispered to one another, leaning over their tables, consulting notes, exchanging glances that spoke louder than any words. Thomas's composure crumbled with each revelation. One by one, his allies faltered, investors whispered into phones, assistants paused mid-step, and colleagues who once whispered behind my back now stared at Thomas with a mixture of disbelief and vindication. The fortress he had built from intimidation and favoritism was cracking, each revelation a chisel striking at the foundation of his power. Harris cleared his throat, voice authoritative. "Thomas, these documents, the recordings, if verified externally, your position is indefensible." Thomas's face twitched, a mask of control fading. "This is nonsense. Lies. You're all being manipulated." I leaned forward, eyes locked on him, voice unwavering. "Check the timestamps. Check the signatures. Check the email chains. Every thread, every document, every digital footprint is undeniable. This isn't manipulation. This is truth." The boardroom seemed to hold its breath. Cameras flashed as Harris motioned for assistants to secure evidence. Notes scribbled frantically, and legal advisors murmured urgently into phones. Thomas's voice faltered, then raised again in a final, desperate attempt to assert dominance. She's desperate. She'll fabricate anything to save her own skin. I straightened, the USB still in my hand, the glow from the screen illuminating my face. Desperate? I asked. Soft. Lethal. No, this isn't desperation. This is accountability. And today, justice doesn't bend to arrogance. It doesn't cower to manipulation. It rises. Gasps, murmurs, and shifting chairs filled the room. Board members, investors, and colleagues watched as Thomas's empire unraveled in real time. He was no longer the man who had commanded floors with a glance. He was human, vulnerable, exposed. I stepped back, letting the silence settle, letting the weight of months of erasure, of theft, of manipulation, fall upon him. Every eye in the room was on me now. Recognition replaced dismissal. Respect replaced indifference. For once, I was not invisible. As the meeting adjourned, whispers followed Thomas as he left the room, a shadow of the authority he once wielded. Colleagues approached me cautiously, hesitant but admiring. "Aaliya, you did it," one whispered. Another nodded, voice quiet but firm. "We've been overlooked for too long. You made them see." I gathered my things slowly, deliberately, heels echoing against the floor like the beat of a drum marking victory. Outside, the streets of Manhattan roared with life, indifferent and vast, but I felt a quiet triumph. I had reclaimed not just my work, but my power, my name, my dignity. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, city lights flickering across the skyline. Emails flooded in, offers, congratulations, interviews, LinkedIn notifications blinked relentlessly. Forbes, the Financial Times, and every major outlet had already picked up the story. The woman who refused to be erased. Whistleblower who took down a titan of finance. I smiled, finally free from the weight of invisibility. Not revenge, not gloating, just justice, and the knowledge that anyone who had ever been silenced could rise, reclaim, and make their voice undeniable. Months later, as I stood at a podium in front of a room packed with aspiring Black professionals in finance, I shared my story, not to boast, but to empower. "They erased my name once," I said, voice resonant, "but names aren't so easily erased when we write them ourselves. Stand up, speak out, fight, and when they try to bury you, rise anyway." Applause thundered, faces turned upward, eyes wide, hearts inspired, and for the first time in years, I felt the weight of the city lift. I had been erased. Now, I was unforgettable. The days after Thomas Whitaker's fall were surreal. Walking into the office felt different, yet eerily familiar. The same polished marble floors, the same fluorescent hum, the same hushed corridors, but the energy had shifted. Where whispers once tried to cut me down, there was now a cautious respect. Colleagues who had once passed me in silence now offered nods, subtle smiles, acknowledgement that had previously been denied. I sat at my desk one morning, coffee steaming beside me, reflecting on the months of struggle, strategy, and sheer endurance it had taken to get here. Each stolen idea, each overlooked effort, each subtle erasure had carved lines of fire and resilience into me. I realized something crucial. Survival in corporate America, especially as a Black woman, wasn't just about talent. It was about vigilance, courage, and the ability to recognize when the game was rigged and refuse to play by unfair rules. The company had changed too. Not overnight, not completely, but cracks appeared in the old hierarchy. People who had once thrived on manipulation now had to navigate transparency. The board instituted new oversight, policies to prevent credit theft, anonymous reporting systems, and while not perfect, it was progress. A sign that accountability could ripple outward when someone refused to stay silent. But the most important change was internal. I no longer measured myself by others' recognition. My power wasn't dependent on applause, smiles, or credit sheets. It was in my preparation, my foresight, my integrity. I had become both the strategist and the sentinel, the protector of my own name and work. I realized that true influence wasn't about asserting dominance over others. It was about ensuring that your voice and your work could never again be stolen, ignored, or dismissed. Messages started arriving, mentorship requests, Congratulations, students and young professionals reaching out. Marisol, the young analyst I had inspired months before, was thriving. Her note had reminded me that my fight wasn't only personal, it was generational. Every effort, every strategic move, every silent victory became a blueprint for others who would follow. My story became a symbol, a testament that resilience, strategic thinking, and refusing to be silenced could change not just one life, but the culture around you. I remember one evening, late, sitting in my Brooklyn apartment, city lights glinting off the glass like stars scattered across water. I reflected on the woman I used to be, the one who believed hard work alone guaranteed recognition. She was gone. In her place stood a woman who understood nuance, strategy, and the value of silence and timing. I smiled at the transformation, understanding that justice wasn't always instantaneous. Sometimes it was the quiet, calculated persistence that dismantled empires built on arrogance and theft. The lessons were clear. First, know your worth and guard it fiercely. Let no one rewrite your story or claim the work that belongs to you. Second, never underestimate the power of preparation. Every file saved, every email duplicated, every note taken in secret can become the foundation of accountability. Third, speak truth to power, but choose the moment when your voice will resonate the loudest. And finally, lift others as you rise. The strength of a community, of shared resilience, is immeasurable. One person's courage can ignite a movement. And in the world of corporate politics, sometimes that spark is enough to illuminate the shadows where injustice thrives. I thought of Thomas Whitaker occasionally. Not with vengeance, not with obsession, but with clarity. His fall had been necessary, but it was secondary to my growth. The real victory wasn't in his defeat, it was in my emergence. I had reclaimed my name, my power, my dignity, and with that reclamation, I had created a path for others, proving that systems designed to erase voices could be challenged and changed. Standing before a room of aspiring professionals months later, I shared my story, not as a boast, but as guidance. You will face obstacles, I said, voice steady, carrying both weight and warmth. People will try to take credit for your work, diminish your contributions, or make you feel invisible. But remember this: silence isn't neutral. Fight with strategy, fight with integrity, and fight with patience. Because when you claim your space and protect your name, you don't just survive, you inspire a generation. The applause that followed was more than acknowledgement, it was connection. Recognition of struggle, recognition of triumph. And in that room, I realized the full power of what I had fought for. Not revenge, not fame, not wealth, justice, representation, legacy. And as the applause echoed, I knew one unshakable truth: they could erase names, manipulate systems, and try to silence voices, but they could never erase courage, resilience, or the stories we write for ourselves. I was no longer just Aaliya Brooks. I was a standard, a warning, and a beacon all at once. And nothing, not Thomas, not corporate politics, not anyone, could take that away from me. If Aaliya's story resonated with you, if you've ever been overlooked, erased, or underestimated, don't stay silent. Stand up, protect your name, claim your work, and most importantly, lift others as you rise. Drop a comment below and share your own story of persistence. Share this video with someone who needs to hear: you are seen, you are powerful, and your voice matters. Hit that like button if you're ready to rewrite your story. And subscribe for more stories of resilience, strategy, and triumph in the face of injustice. Remember, they can try to erase you, but only you can define your legacy.